Hi guys, welcome back to Flatwater. Um, Thanks for bearing with me recently. After the last few videos that I put out, and a lot of the work that I've done recently, uh, a lot of it was more deep, more quite serious stuff. So I wanted to do something to have a little bit of fun, and I put together a music video. And about halfway through, or after I'd created the first quick video, I realized that there was a lot more to it. Uh, and so I went back to the drawing board and refined some parts. So thank you for bearing with me, for the people who have, and I apologize for my little perfectionist tendencies of pulling it down a couple times and putting it back up to get it right. There was a couple times it ripped really poorly. What happens is when you're doing these longer movies, you'll create the movie, everything looks good, you rip it, it takes 3-4 hours to rip for a high quality movie, HD, and then when you come back and check the final product, sometimes you find out that there's a couple mistakes in there, and you don't want to leave that up. So you take it down, and then people get angry. But c'est ça, c'est la vie. Anyways, on to other bigger and better things. So after the last couple of discussions that we've had, there's been quite a few things that have come up to my mind, anyways, that I'd like to add to a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about recently. So that's what this episode will be about. And also in this episode, we're going to talk about what is HAARP. What is HAARP? What does it do? And now that we know that the globe is not a globe, that the world is not a globe, that we live on a plane, we can surmise, we can easily see that HAARP is not exactly as they have made it out to be. In other words, the purpose that they tell us of HAARP is as an ionospheric heater. And one of the main reasons when you watch about HAARP in documentaries, they talk about that they're able to heat the envelope of the ionosphere and excite the particles and push them further up into space, and thereby extend the ionosphere. So, being that we're flat earthers now, we know that there isn't some sort of a liquid atmosphere, a liquid ionosphere up there, depending on how you classify it. Anyways, it's not how they say it is, that's for sure. We don't have just an air atmosphere up there that they can bend with heat. So obviously this is not what they're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch this short documentary. Very brief. This is Nick Begich. You guys probably know him. You've probably seen him before. Everywhere. Alex Jones on all the normal conspiracy shows. So we're going to continue with a short speech by him, and then we'll pick up after that. Thanks, guys. Ciao.
The system that we're talking about is going to be the HAARP system, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, operating up here in Alaska. And if you also think about, and most people remember this from even high school science, but the magnetic field lines that come from the South Pole stretching around and then intersecting at the North Pole and surrounding the planet. These magnetic field lines are very much similar to what you would see on a bar magnet illustration in your basic science books, or in a motor. If you think about the Earth spinning and actually creating a dynamo, a motor, and these magnetic field lines being one of the outproducts of that, in conjunction with interaction with the solar wind, you get things like the magnetosphere and the magnetotail, which comes back behind sort of the way the downwind of the planet, if you will, from the sun itself. In any case, this dynamic of the Earth's motion, solar radiation, the interplay of all of the various factors of the planet are looked at in separate, independent, individual science, not really looked at in integrated science. How do all those systems work together, and what do they create in outcomes? But as we look at HAARP, the primary idea is to affect this ionosphere and then affect these magnetic field lines. And ideally, you want to affect those magnetic field lines and the closest place to which they intersect the planet, which happens to be at the poles. And in the case of where Alaska sits on a map, very near the poles, the furthest northern territory in the United States, where you could locate a facility on U.S. territory that you could inject energy directly into the magnetic field lines of the Earth. We're going to be talking about an area above the Earth's surface, about 30 miles above the Earth's surface, moving out several hundred miles beyond that, the ionosphere. It's a highly charged area. It filters out cosmic radiation, various particle streams that without it would make life impossible on the planet. Now, one of the ideas behind HAARP, which is an array or field of antenna here in Alaska, 180 antennae in the array today, it fires or concentrates, focuses radio frequency energy that it literally sends up into a relatively narrow beam, affecting the magnetic field lines in one instance where the energy is normally, naturally flowing from the South Pole, coming up, arcing high above the equator, and then coming back into the North Pole, with the energy flowing from south to north. What happens is those magnetic field lines act as waveguides, so you can pump energy out of HAARP, focus it on those magnetic field lines, and then it screws itself, if you were to be able to see it, with like a corkscrewing motion where the energy is actually moving now from north to south using the magnetic field lines as a waveguide. Now what would that do essentially? If you had, for instance, an intercontinental ballistic missile that gets fired from China to the U.S. and it traverses those magnetic field lines with those charged particles racing along them, using them as waveguides, it would create a virtual shield around the planet, so any of those incoming objects, intercontinental ballistic missiles, any satellites that happen to traverse those areas, or any other electronically sensitive equipment would be destroyed almost instantly. And so when you think about HAARP, there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is manipulation of those field lines, those magnetic field lines, which actually have been mapped. And if you look at some of the ways those are mapped is barium particles are injected into the upper atmosphere and lower ionosphere using barium-laden rockets. What those create when you inject radio frequency energy is air glow, where you get this sort of light-up effect. So you can actually see this corkscrewing motion around those magnetic field lines and serving as waveguides. In fact, they did that test a number of years ago in Alaska. And they do these from time to time, just more or less illustrate what they think theoretically should happen is actually happening in place and at the time of the experiments. Now, HAARP as an array of antenna can be focused and concentrated. You've got to think about this in a much different way than normally how radio frequency energy behaves. If you think about a radio broadcast antenna, broadcasting radio frequency energy, that energy dissipates or spreads out very rapidly from the point of broadcast, the antenna, out into the atmosphere. And the further away you get, the less dense, the less concentrated is that radio frequency energy, which is why radio stations eventually fade out over distance. On the other hand, what HAARP does is by firing this array or field of antennas, you imagine firing them in such a way as to create kind of a corkscrewing motion, a cyclotron resonance is what it's called, where that energy is then focused to a smaller and smaller area, and as it hits the ionosphere, it becomes concentrated. And think about that in the same way as light coming off of a laser versus light coming off of a flashlight. When you think about HAARP, think about it as a mechanism on the ground that's designed to interact directly or to plug into those magnetic field lines and actually then use the environment itself as part of the machine on the ground. And think about it in this sense. Think about that machine on the ground, this field of antenna broadcasting radio frequency as a primer, the small amount of energy, because the big energy is contained in the natural environment. The idea is if we understand enough about how these mechanisms work, then we can trigger various cascading effects where it sort of builds on the energy that's naturally in place. And so when you think about HAARP, not just in the effect of magnetic field lines, but another opportunity to manipulate energetic systems within the Earth has to do with the ionosphere itself. And imagine that ionosphere is a bubble around the Earth several hundred miles thick, again starting about 30 miles off the Earth's surface. Now, that's a highly charged area, a tremendous amount of energy potential there. In fact, some will remember a number of years ago, there was a shuttle experiment where they drug a tether, a dangling wire through the ionosphere to see what would happen. And energy was picked up as it moved, because when you move something, a conductor through an electric field that's as charged as the ionosphere, it actually begins to move current, which it did. It shunted that current straight into the shuttle and almost blew it out of the sky. Now, the thing that came out of that didn't get widely talked about was the amount of energy produced could be useful, for instance, for keeping a low orbiting space platform in orbit around the planet, being able to charge it up by just tapping the energy by the fact that it's orbiting the planet and moving through the ionosphere would be one way to charge up these kinds of space-based platforms, whether they were for weapon systems or running low orbiting satellites. But basically moving energy into space in normal, like shuttle payloads, is prohibitively expensive, very difficult to pull off to any great degree. But if you could create an energy source sufficient to run these kinds of systems, then you eliminate all kinds of logistical problems, and you're able to keep these things aloft for great deals of time. Part of the HAARP idea was if you could focus radio frequency energy, you could even concentrate it and send energy directly to these same kind of low orbiting space platforms, as an example. One of the other thoughts with HAARP systems are the actual heating of the ionosphere. And when it's heated, because this energy is concentrated, what happens is the ionosphere then lifts up, moves out several hundred kilometers. Now imagine if you're a satellite drifting through space where there's no atmosphere, and all of a sudden you hit a column of atmosphere. What will happen is it creates friction, and that friction causes that satellite to burn up, and all of a sudden you got a satellite down. When you turn the instrument off, everything goes back to normal, and you have plausible deniability on a satellite going down because nobody knows this kind of technology generally exists. Now, the other place you can use it in that same application, imagine that column going out several hundred miles into space from its normal atmospheric level way down here. Now you got an incoming comet or asteroid coming in from outer space at a tremendous velocity. Now normally those objects, when they hit our atmosphere, they again encounter tremendous friction, they burn up, and most objects dissipate before they ever hit the surface. But big objects, the kinds of objects people are worried about, if you could, say, go from 30 miles of atmosphere to 200 miles of atmosphere, almost 7 times as much distance, and project a trajectory downward, what you're able to do in that instance is literally allow those larger objects to burn up way before they hit the Earth. In fact, the Strategic Studies Institute in London, in reviewing Soviet research on this very same technology, was suggesting that it could be used for not an anti-satellite technology so much as an anti-asteroid or comet-based technology. But all of those things also create a side effect. When you move that much atmosphere up into space, and it's about 30 miles diameter, these columns. So imagine 30 miles in diameter and a couple hundred miles up. Well, below that are pressure systems, high pressure, low pressure systems, and jet streams, all of which can be altered by the manipulation of the ionosphere in this way. And that then creates downstream weather effects that cannot be modeled, that cannot accurately be predicted, and therein lies huge problems. When you start to manipulate by technology applications to create one effect, you might inadvertently create a number of other effects, as is the case with HAARP. Looking at sort of where are these facilities? You know, here in Alaska, we have one at Gokana, which is about 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. Then going across Canada, there's a number of these facilities that are controlled by the Canadian government. Rosalie Bertel has reported on those. Then there is one that sits right up here in northern Norway, and this is run by the Max Planck Institute. And then there are 5 old transmitters in the former Soviet Union. Literally, when you look, they go around the globe. These can be used in conjunction with each other, triangulating to hit the same point, creating unique and different resonance effects and creating even more power. Flipping the planet upside down, in Antarctica, China put in a facility a couple years ago to begin working in this technology. And then Arecibo, Puerto Rico, in the southeastern, off the coast in the southeastern United States, also has a facility that's been retrofitted to essentially do the same thing as HAARP. Were people I had known for over 10 years who had been kicked really, really hard by the establishment and stood up and dusted themselves off and maintained their ethical line and their direction. So we brought them in to talk about mind effects. And Ben Eastland actually was pretty interesting. And what he said is that when he went to DARPA, and he knew Tony Tether on a first-name basis, he was running DARPA at the time, and most of the directors. And when he went around and sort of talked to them about mind effects, what he said to me is, when I asked him to come to the conference, he said, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the least interesting, 2, 3 years ago I would have said no. He said, but now it's a 1 or a 2 because as he went through DARPA, nobody was laughing anymore. They take it very seriously. I mentioned I have a website. There's some DARPA documents there that deal with this subject that are unclassified. We have probably 700, 800 pages of documents there, materials there, and that stuff's all free. I encourage you to go there. It's earthpulse.com, EARTHPULSE.com. So the mind effects issue became important to me and was important prior to getting involved in this work. And I want to talk about some of the things that, these are just to remind me so I don't forget. This book, Between Two Ages, this is Zbigniew Brzezinski. Many of you remember him. He's one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission. He was National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter when he was President of the United States. This book was written when he was at Columbia University back in the early 1970s. What's important in this book from my perspective is if you read it today, it's a history. It's not a forecast. It talks about what would happen as a result of technologies from the Americas, Africa, Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia. If you read it today, it is so right on in terms of its predictions. And some would say it wasn't a prediction, it was a conspiracy. If you're in his shoes, it was planned. We already talked about that. But it did happen. Okay, now on page 54 to 56 of this book are some really important things. And there were some observations, some quotes from an earlier publication called Unless Peace Comes, which was published in 1969. And in that there was a chapter called How to Wreck Your Environment, which this is before Earth Day, 1969. So people were still thinking in that frame. You know, and as I said earlier, even conservatives in Europe are awake enough to realize you can't destroy this planet without destroying yourself. And I appreciate all of that. But what he said, what he quoted was a guy named J.F. Gordon MacDonald. MacDonald was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson. He was a professor of geophysics at UCLA. And what he said is if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of populations over huge geographic areas. Now, what was important about that is in 1969, when he made that quote, and in the early 70s when it was re-quoted by Brzezinski, the technology, as far as we know, didn't exist. HAARP provided that way to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way. Now, going back to this slide, this is a high-frequency transmitter that, through primary and secondary effects, can actually cover 16 decades of frequency, everything from very low frequency to visible light, by manipulating the signal and manipulating components of the natural environment. Think about it as if you're plugging in with this little bitty small transmitter into the Earth and then being able to manipulate the Earth by manipulating the energy itself and being able to capitalize on that energy, which is huge amount of energy that the Earth has available to it if you could figure out how to trigger it. And that's really what a lot of HAARP was all about. Now, this idea of Earth-penetrating tomography in the ELF range. Within that range, if we think about sort of where our brains are at, in our deepest states of sleep, 1 to 4 hertz, delta state, where we're really out cold. Theta, running approximately 4 to 7 hertz or pulses per second, vibrations per second. This is where you are in that kind of twilight stage between awake and asleep, where you're conscious of your dreams. This is where 3 to 6-year-olds spend most of their time. You know, and if you, I have 5 children. You know, I remember this. I got 4 grandchildren. I remember this. You know, they confuse the imaginary with the real because this is where they're at. And we call them attention deficit disordered, and they're not. This is their normal state of consciousness, which is why Europeans are way ahead of the game. They generally don't start their children in school till around 7, which makes sense because then they're ready for the academic learning. Approximately 7 to 12 hertz or pulses per second, the alpha range, that zone, if you're an athlete or a writer, that creative place. I mean, the ideal state of learning is there. And then above that range, the beta ranges, and then further up, where you get increasingly more agitated, the higher that frequency goes. What there is, and it has been discovered, and the book I'm out of now is Controlling the Human Mind. What they discovered is frequency following response, FFR. This is the idea of the brain locking onto an external signal and beginning to mirror that signal, and essentially locking onto that external signal. And these don't have to be very powerful. They just have to be within the window frequencies that the brain will recognize, and then you begin to follow them. Consequently, your emotional state can be altered or changed on a pretty mass scale. Now, if you're near field, you have something near you that has a stronger signal within approximately the same ranges, you'll tend to move that direction versus something that's very weak coming from the ionosphere. But this did exactly what J.F. McDonald suggested, is the ELF range could be generated and then this frequency following response created in large segments of the population. From my perspective, this became really, really important. And now that everybody's taken my copy of Earth Rising the Revolution, somebody have a copy of that you just bought, I could use it. Not that one, I need the Earth Rising the Revolution title so I can quote from it as I'm walking through this. Yeah, that's the one I need to borrow for just a minute if you'd bring it forward. I can't remember them all. Thank you very much, and I'll get that back to you. The thing that struck me about this, and I'll show some more overheads on this, but there was a publication called Orienteer. It's a military journal published in Russia. There was an article published there on mind effects that was pretty interesting to me. This was reprinted in the U.S. Army War College quarterly called Perimeters. I believe it was a winter of 1998, but you can look it up. And the article in the U.S., you can look up the article name on the internet. It's called "The Mind Has No Firewalls." And I'm just going to read one quote. It's a lengthy article, but I'll just read one quote that kind of puts this into perspective. And this is what it says. A psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal, unquote. Then he goes into a bunch of other ideas around the same theme, essentially saying that any of these carriers, you could manipulate that signal so that you could create this FFR, this frequency following response. What's important, and I'll put this in context of even politics and marketing, the frequency following response is taught in every college that teaches psychology these days because they utilize this knowledge. Now, this is not restricted in terms of how you can utilize it. So something as simple as the flicker rate on a television screen is sufficient that within 20, 30 seconds to create that response in most people. Now, when you come home, most people go home, they watch television, they're tired, they're fatigued, they sit down, they're watching the television, their husband or wife is hollering at them, dinner's ready, and they're totally in trance, right? I mean, we've all seen it. Everybody's laughing, right? You've seen it because you've been there. And you're in this light, sort of trance-like state. Well, then you add in the flicker rate, and how you can tell there is a flicker rate and whether it's a coherent rhythmic signal. Just look at the white wall behind you when it's playing, and then you can get an idea of that. But you can then run the flicker rate in such a way that within just very few seconds, you actually are in a very suggestive state. The regular ad, the overt advertising hits you. Most people don't have firm opinions on very much, so you can move 1% or 2% of the population in a certain direction. For political purposes, you can see the ramifications of that pretty easily. If you remember during George Bush Jr.'s first election, he got in trouble for using subliminals, where he's using words. And the Democrats, and he had the rats and the stuff, you know, and then he got caught, and they shut that down. Well, that's regulated and creates those kind of controversies, but the flicker rate, FFR, doesn't do it. And I want to mention that the easiest form of mind control, the easiest form, all you have to do is give the population a sense of anxiety, worry, or fear. And as soon as you have that in a population, you cannot reach your higher states of consciousness. It is impossible to reach your higher states of consciousness. So the easiest manipulation, the Baptist minister's known for years, and the government's known even longer. You know? And when you think about it, it's pretty simple. You know, if you can let go of the fear, then you can reach these higher states of consciousness where actually solutions can be developed and resolutions created. And I want to say a little bit more of that, because I was alluding to it earlier when I was talking about how many people sort of fall off the edge of this work. Usually it's they begin to get fearful. And in this, the alternate energy field, you see a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. You're done. As soon as you're there, you're done. You're not going to be effective. You're probably not going to achieve your objectives unless it's strictly by mistake and the randomness of the odds. That is the adversary. And I think as we step into each thing that we do, we should only step into what we know we can do. Do that first. The next thing reveals itself. You know, have a general direction. Do what you know absolutely in your heart and in your mind you can accomplish. You'll do it with confidence. You'll do it fearlessly. And people have asked me, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid? No. The answer is no. I never have been. And the minute I am, I stop this work, because then I've gone beyond the capability that I believe I can achieve. And I think all of us have to start to think about that, because the fact is, if we're in fear and anxiety, we cannot function in the way that we were designed as human beings to function.
Okay, we're back. So as you guys just saw in that video, as Nick Begich was talking about HAARP, he described the positioning of HAARP on the globe, on the planet, on the plane. So the positions that he talked about, we're going to show you them here. I pull up this map. Okay, so basically what you see here is the locations that they admit that they have HAARP locations on the plane. So what you can see is that, as Nick was talking about, they're all centered around the North Pole. Isn't that funny that it's only the North Pole? You'd think if it was a globe that they'd want to have HAARP at the South Pole. That's a more secure location. They've got their treaties in effect. They could secure it more easily. So obviously there is no South Pole. It's wrapped around us as a giant ice wall. So he's pointed out that they've positioned all of the HAARP locations around the North Pole, and as you can see from this map, and as you can see from the azimuthal equidistant, that it's the best location. It's the center of the world, and putting HAARP in these 4 positions gives them complete coverage of the plane. And as you heard Mr. Begich talk about, HAARP seems not to be some sort of an ionospheric heating device, although that is part of how it operates, I believe. It looks to me more like it is a weather manipulation and mental, personal, frequency following manipulation device. So that's my conclusion. That's where I'm going to leave this video for now. You guys talk about it, talk amongst yourselves, and of course leave me some messages and tell me what you think. Thanks guys. I'll see you again soon on Flatwater.